This section is on Christ estates. So are we talking about some real estate, some big mansion and 100 acres? Is that what we're talking about here? What are the estates of Christ? According to theologians, there's two estates. Okay, in relation to what happened in the incarnation, you have the descent and the ascent. Okay, the humbling and then the exaltation. So let's talk about that a little bit. The descent, there's a word, Greek word, katabasis, which means to go down. Kata means down, basis means go. So again, this is the humbling, the going down. Christ becomes a man and humbles himself to the point of death. And this is related to the idea of kenosis. You've heard of that word. Mm-hmm. This is actually found in Philippians 2:7. What the word literally means, to empty or emptying. So kenosis is Christ's self-emptying. And a lot of people have thought, well, that means that he emptied himself of his deity, or part of his deity, or access to his deity powers. Well, let's look at Philippians 2, by the way, the Greek word kenosin. Philippians 2, I'll show you the word in verse 7. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Okay, so let's look at verse 5. Have this mind among yourself, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. Okay, so obviously, it's not like he gave up his equality with God in the sense of his divine nature. He is in the form of God, but he humbles himself, empties himself, not of his divine nature, but he takes on the form of a servant. He takes on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And then look what it says later. This is the exaltation. This is the ascent. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed upon him the name that is above every name. So did he become divine again? Did he take back his divine attributes when he was exalted? We're talking about a humbling and an exaltation. So yes, in some sense, his glory was hidden, the use of his attributes were restrained, but this does not suggest that he gave up his attributes, that he became less than God. So remember, remaining what he was, he became what he is. He was not. And in doing so, there was a humbling. I mean, look at where he was born. Right? Born in a place where they take care of livestock. He humbled himself, not just in his birth, but also through his life and then to the point of his death. But then God exalted him. So, descent and ascent. Any thoughts on kenosis? So we've talked about the extent to which Jesus used or operated in his deity while he was on the earth. That has to do with this. If you have a strong understanding, a strong view of kenosis or an extreme view, where you think that means that he gave up his attributes, and obviously you're not going to have the position that I have on that. But remember, we talk about the divine-human union, the perichoretic union, mutual participation, humanity and deity, and deity and humanity. So, his humanity and his deity are both functioning as he is on the earth. Yes?
So negatively, you don't see emptying as referring to like disassociating himself from his divinity. Like positively, what do you see emptying referring to?
I see it referring to his humbling.
Okay.
Again, it has to do with the descent.
Okay.
The katabasis, the going down. And so, yes, his glory was veiled.
Mm-hmm.
His use of attributes were restrained.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that in his active consciousness, maybe his human mind was catching up to his divine mind. He did. He grew up and increased in knowledge, wisdom, and stature with God and man, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was normal human development. And surely you see this as a humbling, as a katabasis, as a descent. It's a great humbling. But that doesn't mean he's any less than he was before. Let me read a quote from Odin here. Humiliation does not mean that God has been degraded or diminished, but rather that God the Son freely enters our human condition by becoming flesh and becoming obedient unto death and burial, after which there can be no further humbling. So you can't go any lower than that. Went to the lower parts of the earth, right? Then he is exalted to return to the bosom of the Father. So he comes down. In fact, I'm going to show you a little diagram that Odin has in his book in a minute here. So let's talk about the ascent, anabasis, to go up. Okay? So here's a little chart. You have his descent. So this is movement downward. The Son must come from above. The Son is sent from the Father. The Son is descending. And then you have his ascent. So this begins, I guess, at the resurrection, or maybe immediately after his death. He must go from the world. He must return to the Father. He will ascend to heaven. So God has highly exalted him. So you have a move downward and you have a move upward. The descent and the ascent, the estates of Christ. Any further discussion? So no, I don't see him emptying himself of his attributes, or even the use of his attributes, or even the independent use of his attributes. He never acted independently of his Father anyway, in the Spirit.
Right.
So, but the use of his attributes were restrained.
Through his choices to obey.
Through his choices to obey, he was led by the Spirit, led by the Father. He says, that which I hear, that I speak. He's always he came to do the will of the Father. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. So he had a purpose for coming. And that involved him humbling himself even to the point of death. And I see that as kenosis. Surely you see that as an emptying. Though he were rich, he became poor. Was Jesus rich? but he became poor. He left his estate, his glorious estate, and came down and humbled himself, and then was exalted. So, all right. So now let's talk about Christ's offices. Anybody off the top of your head, and I know you see the notes there, but right off the top of your head, what are the offices? Well, you wrote on this.
It's prophet, priest, and king.
Prophet, priest, and king. The old Methodists were encouraged to preach Christ in all of his offices. Prophet,